Can you see the full screen now for my talk?
I believe so.
And can you hear my voice?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, can you see my lovely face?
Yes.
Yeah.
All of
Okay, here we go. Here we go. This is called Climate Emergency. Why radical interventions are needed now to stop climate apocalypse. That was the title of my book. Here's a few little film clips to warm us all up. Okay, so there's the book, and that's my name, and that is a picture of the Earth. So let us begin. I started as a psychologist that was interested in climate change denial. I did something about 5 years ago on the process of psychological denial, but as things evolved, the denial changed. So at the end of this talk, we're going to talk a little bit about denial, but in the beginning, we're going to get an overview of everything. And if you start reviewing the scientific literature on this subject, you're going to end up writing the same part 1 of your book the same way I did. It's called Despair, Worse Than You Think and Worse Than You Can Imagine. So this talk is going to start in a very dark place as we confront the science that is so absolutely frightening. So here it comes. It begins with this, and almost every one of these sentences makes you want to say, oh my God, I can't believe this. 3 billion birds have left North America since 1970. Total animal populations have declined 60% since 1970. Flying insects declined 75%. Bees, ants, and beetles declining 8 times faster than mammals. We are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction of this planet. 90% of frogs have disappeared since 1970. That's called the frog apocalypse. Beavers, crocodiles, giant turtles, sturgeon have fallen 88% since 1970. In addition, incredible heat records, we read about them every single day. 11 of the last 12 years have been the hottest recorded since 1850. The hottest month ever recorded was June 2019, and then they changed it to July 2019. The hottest day in Paris ever recorded was 114 degrees last August 2019. But just this May, we had the hottest May ever recorded in human history. For the last 42 years, global temperatures have exceeded their long-term averages. So one of the climate scientists that I read made this statement. He said, no human being has ever lived on a planet this hot. Not for centuries, that is to say. Now, there are more facts that we have to confront. More than half of the carbon exhaled into the atmosphere by the burning of fossil fuels has been emitted in just the last 3 decades. We thought we were making progress. Greenhouse gas emissions have increased faster in 2018 than they did in the prior 6 years. So everything is just getting worse. Now, China is known as the world's leader in solar and the world's leader in wind, but it's also the world's leader in pollution. It's now representing 30% of the global emissions of the world. The United States is down to about 15%. And China is a very, very big problem. China burns more coal than the United States, Japan, and Europe combined. 800 million people in China burn coal in their homes. China is building or planning to build, despite their beautiful rhetoric about green energy and solar and wind. They are building 300 coal plants in Turkey, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Egypt. This is a coal plant they're just building in Serbia. This is a coal plant they're building in Pakistan. This is a coal plant they're building in Africa. This is a map of the financing that China is engaged in. It's building these plants so it can export its coal to all these different countries, 23 different countries in all. We're talking about very contemporary data here. This is frightening. Now, beyond China, we have extreme weather statistics. Category 5 hurricanes were not that well known in the past. They're becoming commonplace. In 2016 to 2019, we had the longest sequence of Category 5 hurricanes. We had one in Puerto Rico, one in the Bahamas, one in Florida. This is Abaco, Bahamas. Last year, it looked like a nuclear weapon had gone off on that island. So if we switch from heat records to these other things that I'm mentioning, now we go to melting and drought. In 1910, there were 150 glaciers in Montana. There are 27 today. Glaciers are melting in the Andes, the Rockies, the Alps, the Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau. That's the Rhone Valley, 1849, now 2019. Now, beyond drought, we have wildfires. This is the cover of my book. It's a composite of all the fires of 2019 that NASA made. It's called The Earth on Fire. And those are the fires that occurred in 2019. Now, the Indonesian fires in 1997 emitted 2.6 billion tons of carbon. That's 40% of the annual global emissions. One set of fires in one country was the equivalent of 40% of the entire world's output. In 2015, Indonesia did it again with their palm oil plantations, burning peat, and they emitted more CO2 than the United States of America did. One set of fires. And we thought we were trying to conserve and behave properly and cut back on our carbon footprint. But Indonesian fires just erased the blackboard for us. Here comes Greta Thunberg to talk, to summarize a little bit of what we're talking about.
The main solution, however, is so simple that even a small child can understand it.
I hope you can hear her.
We have to stop the emissions of greenhouse gases. And either we do that or we don't. You say nothing in life is black or white, but that is a lie, a very dangerous lie. Either we prevent a 1.5 degree of warming or we don't. Either we avoid setting off that irreversible chain reaction beyond human control or we don't. Either we choose to go on as a civilization or we don't. That is as black or white as it gets. We must change almost everything in our current societies. The bigger your carbon footprint is, the bigger your moral duty. The bigger your platform, the bigger your responsibility. Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house was on fire. Because it is.
I hope you can hear that. So we're still looking at this literature, and it's taking us to new places. New diseases are appearing that are slightly related to global warming, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. Zika, Eastern equine encephalitis in Michigan, chikungunya virus, West Nile virus, ticks, yellow fever, Candida auris, sandflies, swine flu, SARS, MERS, CRE. There is now a worldwide African swine flu epidemic, which is estimated to will exterminate 25% of all the pigs in the world. There are, as the tundra and the permafrost melt, we're finding new viruses that haven't existed in a long, long time. A 32,000-year-old bacteria was revived in 2005. An 8-million-year-old bug was brought back to life in 2007. Here's a worm that was frozen for 42,000 years, and it was brought back and revivified. Now, beyond that, I think the most alarming statistic is this. This was presented by Al Gore in his movie. It was an ice core in Antarctica, and they pulled up the ice core and they looked at the bubbles and they measured the CO2 content of the bubbles. It went back 800,000 years, and the CO2 levels, you can see there, were higher now than they have been in 800,000 years. Now, since Al Gore's movie, they went to the Allen Hills in Antarctica and they dug deeper. They went 200 meters, pulled up another ice core that took us back 2 million years. Same technique. And the conclusion was the carbon dioxide level today is 38% higher than at any time in the last 2 million years. We are really living on borrowed time. Now, we've heard all these scenarios about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees. What is that? The Paris Accords was an attempt to get all the nations of the world to agree to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees, okay? 75% of the countries so far have not lived up to their commitments, okay? Now, I read a study from the World Meteorological Association in November of last year. It said that the temperature of the Earth increased 0.2 of a degree of centigrade between 2015 and 2019. That's that period of time. Now, if you use that as your benchmark, then we're going to get to 1.5 degrees of warming in 2027. We're going to get to 2 degrees by 2036, and we're going to get to 3 degrees by 2057. This is an emergency. This is beyond what we could, with what we've been thinking. It's beyond what the Paris Accords were thinking. It's beyond the Green New Deal. Gary just gave me a document from the House Select Committee 2020, and they say in this document, we need to cut emissions 47% by 2030. Okay, they're still operating at 2030, fine. But as we shall see, this is still very much a pipe dream. Okay, at this point you should say, okay, stop, Jerry. I've had enough bad news. Are you done? And the answer is no. The worst is still here. Feedback amplification loops, the tipping points of no return. These are, I'm sure you're familiar with this. You have one variable which influences another variable, and that influences a third, that influences a fourth, and then it influences the first variable. A feedback loop is created, and human beings are no longer involved. It becomes an autonomous process. So there are at least 3 that we should pay attention to. The first one, global warming produces melting of the polar caps. The albedo of the Earth changes, the permafrost melts, CO2 is released, methane is released, and that makes us warmer. So the process continues and continues and goes round and round. This is the Arctic contains 1.8 trillion tons of carbon. That's twice as much as is now in the atmosphere. When that melts, it can discharge the CO2 into the atmosphere along with methane. And the methane is 34 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. Here's a Russian movie of a guy poking a hole in the permafrost. He's telling his son, be careful.
Держи факел, держи факел. Кислее подбей.
Watch this.
Только аккуратно.
Methane. Okay, that makes the point. So here's that feedback loop. Global warming changes the Arctic ice melts, the permafrost melts, the albedo of the earth changes. That leads to higher levels of greenhouse gases, which in fact leads to more global warming. And on it goes. No longer is human input involved. That's a picture of the North Pole in 1979. That's a picture in 2003. And then I saw this in 2019, and I didn't want to believe what I saw. There was no North Pole. And I tried to vet this photograph. I couldn't vet it. I couldn't prove that it was Photoshop or not Photoshop, so I didn't use it in my book. But what I did use was this. This is 1984 and 2016. It's quite obvious that the polar ice caps are shrinking. The albedo of the Earth is reduced. It's not reflecting sunlight. It's absorbing more heat. The top of the Earth is turning blue. Second feedback loop is much simpler. Warming produces drought. Drought produces fires. Fires release CO2, which makes more warming. And it becomes a circular pattern, a circular feedback loop. In Indonesia, peatlands hold 5 times more carbon. And one study showed that 40% of the peatlands are drier than they have been in the last 1,000 years. 24% are drier than they have been in the last 2,000 years. So they're just fuel that is ready to be ignited. So there you have the feedback loop for drought, wildfires, and greenhouse gases. This is a short movie explaining all of these feedback loops in perhaps a much better way than I do.
About us avoiding going over a 2-degree rise
I hope
in
you
the
can
temperature
hear
of the planet. Why are they so worried about that? If we go over that amount of warming, there are feedback loops in our ecosystems, tipping points that climate change could spin out of control, and it happens like that.
There are switches that can be tripped where suddenly you are in brand new territory and you don't even begin to know what to do about it. This is not a linear kind of problem that we're dealing with. This is very much an exponential kind of problem.
Right now, we're on the edge of 3 major tipping points. The first one is the Arctic ice cap. That ice cap's like a mirror. It reflects the sun's light off of the Earth and keeps it from warming us up. But as it melts, you get a smaller mirror, which means a warmer Earth, which means more melting, which means more climate change. Another example is Arctic methane. We've got a gigantic amount of methane gas frozen into the tundra. And it is 50 times as toxic as CO2 is. It's CO2 on steroids. As it warms, and that methane gets released, it then causes global warming to get worse, which means it warms more, which means more methane released, which means worse warming. And all of that process spins out of control. Another example of a tipping point is ocean acidification. As you get more CO2 in the atmosphere, a lot of it actually is going into our oceans. And a lot of stuff, like plankton, can't live in that kind of acidified water. And plankton is the basis of the food chain. If the plankton die, we lose the whole ocean ecosystem.
These kinds of feedback loops and tipping points are what keep me up at night, that we will hit one before we're able to turn things around.
Even if we went cold turkey today because of the time lags in our climate system, we've already signed up for things that we can't see yet.
We live in a razor.
Okay, now almost all of our calculations are linear. We're assuming that the Earth is increasing at a linear level, 2.2 parts per million per year, and it's going that way. But when these tipping points are breached, we could have exponential growth that just takes everything out of the realm of possibility for us. We no longer are things predictable. So that's the danger of these feedback loops. So here's Greta summarizing this, and now we're going to start turning a little more positive. So if you've put up with me to this point, I promise you some degree of relief. You could have a pill, though, around this time.
End of my talk. And this is where people usually start talking about hope. Solar panels, wind power, circular economy, and so on. But I'm not going to do that. We've had 30 years of pep talking and selling positive ideas. And I'm sorry, but it doesn't work. Because if it would have, the emissions would have gone down by now. They haven't. Today, we use 100 million barrels of oil every single day. There are no politics to change that. There are no rules to keep that oil in the ground. So we can't save the world by playing by the rules. Because the rules have to be changed. Everything needs to change. And it has to start today. Thank you.
So Greta is very much a radical, and I noticed as I'm writing this book, I was becoming a radical as well. Because the situation kind of demands it. So this consensus is that we have to cut greenhouse gases 50% by 2030. That's methane to your left. That's CO2 to your right. We don't see any flattening of the curve, any bending of the curve, nothing. We are not turning anything around, and we have to go down 50% in 10 years. That is a huge challenge. So to your left is reality, going up and